am an assistant professor at the University of Utah Huntsman Mental Health Institute, and because of that, I'm going to open it up with some slides and a lecture. So is it all hooked up? Can you guys see them on the screen? Okay. I can't see it here, so yeah. Cool. So what we're going to open up with is what is considered artificial intelligence. This is a word that people are using a lot recently. There's a rich history to it. And one of the reasons you might be confused is that there are dueling definitions of what artificial intelligence means. I'll figure out how to work this in a second. Is it? Oh, okay, it's down there now. So the first thing is the larger set of approaches that have been tried over the last 80 years. And then the other definition is that, I keep pressing the button, it's not, okay, is whatever the latest and greatest approach is. And so in this case, it's large language models, but whatever that definition is has changed and as the cutting edge has advanced. So it's always nice to start these history lessons with this 1956 conference, one of the original ones in AI research, where they organized it at Dartmouth. They got a bunch of specialist mathematicians and statisticians, and when they were organizing it, they defined it, as you can read through most of the paragraph, and decided that they could solve most of this in 2 months, which clearly they accomplished. Yep.
Point it at him.
Oh, point it at him over there? Okay, cool, thank you. So there's been really diverse approaches over the years. Each one of these at various times has been considered AI. Once it's really understood, that term gets dropped. Then something new and cool comes out, and it gets applied to that. So the first is symbolic AI. That's what that group in Dartmouth was working on. And very quickly they realized that this actually doesn't work at all. They don't have really a way to do it. But those approaches have continued on. And so this arrow is very important, that each one of these has persisted. And so when people refer to AI, they could be referring to some modern iteration of symbolic AI. And we could talk about what those are if somebody wants to. And so those then turned into expert systems. And so these are really clearly defined rules about if something happens, what should happen after that. So very deterministic. People also realized that that didn't create some sort of generalizable intelligence that they were excited about, so they stopped calling it AI. They started calling it expert systems. Again, there are a lot of places where this is still super useful. So for example, safety control systems in nuclear plants or a lot of clinical decision support rules are still really old school like this because you can specify it. Then there was what was called the first AI winter. And this came with that disappointment that these rules weren't going to create some super smart machine that could, fly everybody around in a saucer or something like that. And so people gave up, essentially. And that lasted through about the mid-'80s. And then they started playing with cool early neural networks. And so most of the techniques that we have today that we work with neural networks were actually invented in the 1980s. And this was based on the neuroscience of the time. But again, those didn't work. They invented all the techniques, but they didn't really have the computers to effectively implement them. And so there was a second AI winter when people stopped believing that AI was even possible. Then, during the 90s, probabilistic models, decision trees, a lot of these different approaches emerged. And again, people got excited about those, started saying, oh, this is AI. And they'd have some linear regression that does a really good job. And yeah. You also started seeing the revival of neural networks, and this was around 2012, when finally you had enough compute, and so that's the GPUs and NVIDIA and all these sorts of resources, combined with tons of data, and so these methods that were actually invented in the 1980s finally worked, stuff that people had laughed at the entire time. And I'm a neuroscientist. This is about the time I got into the field of neuroscience, and there was a lot of convergence between the two, and so spent a lot of time working on these. So then those deep learning approaches, though, I'll keep pressing the button, someday it'll work. Okay. And so people realized, though, that these deep learning approaches weren't the AI that everybody thought they were. That's when the term machine learning really started to be used, and people stopped referring to them as artificial intelligence because they weren't necessarily intelligent systems. Oh, this is machine learning. And that kind of brings us to the present day of what people kind of refer to. Can we please just, can you advance it? Okay, of foundation models. So this is the large language models and various things like that. And this is kind of the current colloquial definition of AI. When you think of ChatGPT, et cetera, it's kind of these foundation models. It's also considered machine learning. It's just, obviously, they do really amazing things that everyone gets excited about. So when you hear AI, it could refer to all of these techniques, because it is kind of a super category, or it could refer to one of these specific ones. So it's one of the reasons that people get pretty confused about it. So next. All right, so some key considerations for modern AI. First is data. So everybody talks about data. And the reason that's important is that these models have to learn distributions from the data. But that's mostly important for the machine learning models. Those early ones I showed you, the expert systems, the symbolic AI, there's branches where it's important, but for the most part, you can kind of express knowledge within those. So the data in those is actually a lot less important. Next is compute. So that's NVIDIA, all the need for this data infrastructure, and it's particularly important for artificial neural networks. A lot of the other approaches, it doesn't matter as much. Next is a problem focus, and so now we're getting beyond the academics into the stuff that really rubber hits the road, is what are we using the models for? And so we had those whole wide range of techniques that are considered AI. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Because you're gonna find the approach that matches that most likely in the cheapest way. And so it might still be called AI, even though it's one of those old systems that was invented back in the 1950s, or those old approaches. It's really the problem that matters. And then the next thing too is production. And that's the ability to reliably use these models day in, day out. And the older approaches tend to be cheaper and easier than the new ones. And in reality, what you end up a lot of the time getting is a mixture of a lot of these, where you have those foundation models do some very specific things, and then you have some of the rule-based systems do other parts of it. Yeah, and so I just wanted to kind of provide a little bit of background so we can jump into this on the panel. I'm gonna make my way back up to the stage. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves as well? Start with you, Steve.
Sure.
And we can switch back to the regular slide show now. Okay. Oh yeah, I also do weddings in addition to this, but if you guys want to email me, it's fine. Yeah.
Steve Lund, nice to meet everybody. I've been in AI for about 3 decades now. I've worked for Apple and Cisco and HP, and about 14 years ago, I pivoted my career to AI, which now seemed like it was a pretty good idea. I've learned a lot about AI, where to use it, where not to use it. I'm on my 5th startup, AI startup right now. We've got a really interesting platform for research scientists, so very focused in life sciences, research scientists. The definition for me of AI is really where the rubber meets the road, which is how can I use AI in my business for improving operations, efficiency, cleaning data, automating processes that in the past were manual. So we've been working a lot with most of the major pharmaceutical companies. We announced a great partnership today with Seek Labs. We're excited about that because it's taking our platform and applying it in real-world use cases. So we're excited about that partnership. We also announced a university alliance today as well with Utah Valley University, with Stanford, with Harvard, and a couple of other universities that are using our platform to actually teach students about AI. So we're in the middle of where the rubber meets the road here, which is, can AI really solve business problems for me? AI strategy is not, I'm using ChatGPT or Claude or some other AI program. That's really not a strategy. We believe a strategy is start with something small, start with a small use case, try to solve a problem there, and expand once you've learned something from it.
Yeah, and I will say, I had to zoom in a couple hours ago to a meeting on campus we had on foundation models for the genome. And I was talking with Steve, and I think it was your CTO or something, that ended up joining the meeting, and he had some of the more intelligent comments on how we interpret what these networks are doing. So yeah, that was fun.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Josh Tamayo-Sarver. Clinically, I'm an emergency physician, but I actually work through a large physician partnership. And by large, we have about 9,000 doctors. We staff about 550 hospitals. We see about 12 million patients a year. And so we go across specialties, and we own outpatient clinics and that sort of thing. More relevant is we have an innovation hub within that partnership that serves healthcare, and I've been there since 2008. In that time, we've developed and deployed and scaled about 38 different healthcare technologies. The first AI one, I'm going to say AI because it makes it sound more expensive, but it was definitely an ML model, was 2015. So we go back a ways at doing that. And in terms of, what does AI mean to me and how do I define it, is it's really nice because you can just say AI is going to solve it, and it's like saying, my dog is going to solve it, or we're going to work hard, or, I'm going to leave it to a higher power, and because it's nebulous enough. But when it comes down to it, the way we actually use that, and the reason that we've had so much success, I think, in scaling it and putting it into production, is we start with, what are you actually trying to accomplish? And AI, regardless of where it is in the boxes that Warren put up, which was really nice, by the way, I like that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Regardless of where it is, it's kind of like, you've been using your fingers and now someone hands you a calculator. And if someone said, what's your calculator strategy? That's kind of weird, right? But if someone says, well, now that you have a calculator, how are you going to balance the books? It's like, oh, I can do this better now. But it really is a tool and not a strategy or anything.
Yeah, I'll also say Josh knows how to build those calculators. It's been fun talking to him the last couple of days about all the details of the rubber meets the road stuff.
Yeah, we've got a lot of injuries from our mistakes along the ways.
Then Raymond?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Raymond Peterson, CEO of DNA Analytics. And my company has AI algorithms for scientists who are developing and designing gene therapies, gene diagnostics, and messenger RNA vaccines. And basically, our algorithms analyze the nucleic acids. I would classify the algorithms in the scale of machine learning because there are biophysical models that we have been training. And because we've been in the laboratory and generating data that others haven't, we've been able to improve the models by adding sort of more parameters and more value to them. The value of what our software does is that it enables scientists who are designing these gene therapies and gene diagnostics to design them faster, better, and more accurately, which saves them time and money in product development, so they get to the market faster and have a better performing product at the end. And if we're going to say, what do we think AI is and what it's not, my perspective is that what it's not is it's not magic, but it can seem that way. But what it is statistics, and statistics being used in new and different ways.
And I will say, before the conference, we had a Zoom call, and it was just really fun talking about data and the importance of data and how we clean that data and how we organize it. That's the least glamorous, probably, part of this whole thing, and ends up being the most important. So thank you. Cool.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so to follow that up, we're the first in 20 years to add data to the models. But you had also mentioned about foundation models and genomics. That might be something really interesting to talk about. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's definitely a new field, so it's fun digging into that. We can probably talk more about it later. So I'll open it up with some questions, and then would love to take questions from the audience as well. The goal of this is to clarify, because it's just a confusing term right now. And so the first question I have for the panelists is, what is not new, right? Because a lot of the times when the term AI is used, there's this assumption that, hey, ChatGPT came out, everything changed. That was the Sputnik moment. Now we have this AI that does that, kind of related to Josh's comment. So when somebody says AI, what's stuff that we actually have been doing for a while that isn't that new groundbreaking stuff? And then after that, we'll have a question about what is new. But let's start with what's not.
We'll start here?
Yeah.
So I think you mentioned it, it's mathematics, right? That hasn't changed. Whether it's an algorithm, whether it's a model, a mathematical model, all of those have kind of be lumped into AI. And that's been around for a long time. And still used in operations and supply chain efficiencies, manufacturing. I've been working for a while with some large manufacturers around the world, Hyundai and Kia Motors and Ford. And basically these algorithms are to identify problems, right? And those are all mathematically based.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just build on that and say what hasn't changed is most everything actually hasn't changed. Because you still have to do good product development. You still have to identify what is the use case, what problem are you trying to solve. And then for the AI portion, you're still saying what are the inputs, and then what outputs do I need? And then it's just a matter of picking the right tool, and now we have a new tool that's really cool, but it's still a tool that has an input, does math, and gets an output.
Yeah, so I think what hasn't changed is the end goal of making a prediction. And that prediction in the biomedical realm could be what disease this person has, what therapy would be best for them. In retail, it would be like, which store needs to have white t-shirts because they're out of white t-shirts. And so that really hasn't changed. We're trying to make a good prediction. And so what's new is that we have a whole lot more data because we have maybe a whole lot more sensors and way to collect that data. Electronic medical records can be mined. And so that's what's new, is the data that's available to actually see what's happening.
Cool. You jumped the gun. All right, so we started with what's new there. Josh, we'll come back this way. But no, that was great.
Yeah, so for me, from a tech build, how many people in here like build software? Yeah? All right, so maybe you can relate to this. One of the things that's really new is my POCs going to production, like the time continuum part of that has changed dramatically, right? Like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if I could get a great proof of concept, right? If I could show that the tech mostly worked, going from mostly worked to worked was not that big a deal. Now, like with generative AI and LLMs, showing something that can kind of work sometimes takes a moderately sober teenager in a few hours, right? Like, it's not hard. But to go from like, yeah, this kind of works, to this could go into production is sometimes frequently impossible, but is otherwise 99% of the work now. And that really flipped, and it probably took me much longer than it should have to make that realization, and a lot of poorly spent resources.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, I think, when I first started in AI, doing a proof of concept or a pilot, it was usually 2 years and about $2 or $3 million. You'd bring a censor in, you'd get a boatload of data, of books that they would create, they would set on a shelf, and at the end of the day, it still didn't work. So, that's completely changed.
But if it did, you had a winner, right? Like,
Right.
that was the mark of, okay, we're ready to go now.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that has changed is the age of those programmers now that can do things that before it took 15 years of programming experience to do. We've just launched our platform into several high schools in New York. We have a lab with 40 high school students that are now developing and tuning AI models, generative AI models. That is new. Right, getting a 15-year-old, 16-year-old that is as proficient as somebody that's been programming for 20 years is pretty new and pretty exciting, actually.
Another thing that I think is new is the access to ready computing power in the cloud. And the reason is that some of the algorithms we work with are computationally very expensive. And so back in the day, they had to be written in a really low-level language and compiled, and you're like trying to extract the tiniest bit of performance out of that. That was 30 years ago. You've had Moore's Law for 30 years. So general purpose computers with a bunch of cores, and you can spin up a whole bunch of computers, right, and servers. And it's there. You do have to pay for it, but it's not like you have to spend $200,000 or more to buy a cluster to be sitting there. And that really has brought the cost down and made the technology more accessible to many more people.
Yeah. So I also want to give people a chance. Raise your hand if you have a question, and maybe you can shout it out. Dylan?
Hey, everyone. Dylan Doty, Utah Nation Center. Thanks for the history lesson, because I'm a history guy. Like Raymond said, I think AI is magic, so that's kind of where I'm coming at. But I work with early-stage research and development companies to get federal grants, and it just seems like the AI space is very crowded, but there always been for novelty. So with things being faster and easier, how do you, in working in AI, distinguish like your value add compared to competitors?
I didn't mean to plant you, But yeah, that actually leads right into kind of the one of the next questions I was going to bring up is a lot of the times when people talk about AI companies, they divide them into 3 different categories. One is the infrastructure. And so that's just like Raymond was talking about in terms of who's providing the compute to do it, who's providing the tools, the picks and shovels, kind of in that regard. Another one is the model companies. And so that's kind of your OpenAI, your Anthropic, et cetera, that are really focused on building the models that might get served in various ways. And again, that's kind of the colloquial definition. And then there's the products, right? The product focus. And that's agnostic to who's the cloud provider, agnostic to who the model is, or what model you're using, and just really caring about the downstream application and kind of grabbing among those. So I'm curious what you all think about those categories. Obviously, they're simplified. Where your companies fall in there, and where you see, good entry points and innovation, like Dylan talked about in those different spaces. So we'll start with you, Steve.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we partner with infrastructure companies. So we have a very close partnership with AWS, with Google, with Microsoft. So we're agnostic. It can be run in the cloud. It could be on-prem. It could be on bare metal within your own firewall. So that's not where we're at. We're not on the foundation models either. We're not necessarily building models and selling them. We're giving our customers the ability to take any model that they want and modify it, adapt it, tune it to their particular needs and requirements. And your question around ROI actually is really important, because there's certainly a lot of companies that are providing services or technologies, but don't think about, what's the ROI for this? Why should a company even do this? So in the beginning, we typically go in, we'll take a problem very similar to what we did at Seek Labs just 2 weeks ago. They had a problem, they had a huge data set they sent us. We brought it in, we manipulated it, we cleaned it up, we formatted it, organized it in 48 hours, and gave it back to them. And all of a sudden, the ROI was very clear, right? We did something in 48 hours that was going to take them several months to do. So we try to do that very early on to establish credibility and value of the solution that we're bringing to the table.
And Josh?
Yeah, and I think I heard in the question you were applying for grants. Is that right?
So I help startups here in Utah apply for small business innovation research, small business technology.
He's been helping us. That chart I showed you of all the grants we're applying for, that's
Perfect.
for them to do.
Okay. So we have a venture arm that I work with. So I can speak to it from like the venture hat. And our venture hat is highly informed by us getting our hands dirty and actually building startups and companies ourselves. And so for me, when we're looking at AI and saying, is this differentiated? It's a little bit hard, because when you look at someone's diagram of like how their technology works, it's like problem, arrow to AI, then a miracle happens, arrow to solution, right? And that's a little bit too nebulous. So for us, we look for something rare, because acronyms are great. So relevant, that it's actually solving the problem that the user is trying to solve in their life, right? Like, that problem is very context specific, and we all can think of many technologies that solved a really cool something, but it wasn't my problem, so I don't want that technology. And then it needs to be actionable, so it needs to solve my problem at a time that I can do something about it. Predicting I need a parachute after I've been pushed out of the plane, it's relevant, but it's not that actionable, right? I want it before I get pushed out of the plane. Reliable, and that's where, I don't know about other people in the room, it'd be kind of interesting. We have not had any AI production system that only used LLMs yet. And I haven't seen one that I think could work that only uses LLMs. We always need other technologies tied to it to give it the reliability that actually scales it into production. Someday that might not be true. Today it might not even be true, and I just don't know about it. But we've seen a lot of systems, and we haven't seen any that fail that. So, it's got to be reliable. And then what we found, because we don't get an ROI until something's implemented, is it has to be explainable. And I think a lot of the world, this is my opinion, has gone the wrong way with explainable as meaning like transparent or figuring out like what the coefficients are, right? there's a lot in this world that I don't understand how it works, but I can explain it, right? I'm going down the highway, my radar detector goes off, I slam on the brakes. Why did I do it? Because my radar detector went off, right? I can explain that. I don't understand how the radio waves worked in my radar detector. I don't need to. But when I make a decision based on this tool, I need to be able to explain why I made that decision and relied on the tool. So when we're looking at, that was a very long-winded answer, I'm sorry. When we're looking at something to say, do you differentiate from the very crowded field of everybody who's using the then the magic happens AI, we're looking for those criteria.
Well, so for DNA analytics, it's data. The data that we need to train our models, we have to generate in-house. It is not generated in the normal course of biotechnology business, which makes it expensive because we have to make very special data to train the algorithms. But in terms of maybe also answering your question of grants and SBIRs, our company's had about $5 million of SBIR funding. And the reason I think we were successful is we found very specific problems to focus on and went after very specific biomedical applications and then sort of brought the tools to that rather than saying, we've got a tool, where can we apply this to? And so if you're interested in sort of like hearing about our experience with SBR, I'd happy to talk to you afterwards.
And I'll also say on the note of innovation, it's helpful to think AI has been around for 80 years, right? And because of that broad definition of it, a lot of those areas very smart people have been working on for a long time. And so something like regression, you're not necessarily going to have massive advancements in formulating and designing those models. There could be really awesome advancements in terms of how to optimize those models because new hardware is coming out, right? So it could be taking some of these old techniques and how do we match that with new hardware? Or with really the cutting edge approaches, you do actually have active model development there. And so that's some of the stuff that I do in my university lab is, creative model development. A lot of the times that's on the leading edge of commercialization, which is why we do it in the university lab. And so it's, I think, really important to think about the timescale of it and what somebody means when they say AI, because the level of innovation is going to depend on that, and also where it kind of is in that ecosystem. Because there's a lot of innovation that can happen with data and automated ways to clean data. And it's absolutely critical. So those are my thoughts. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, I think back to the data thing, first off, data engineering is incredibly underappreciated. And that's what Raymond was talking about, of actually getting into a format that you can train the models. In academia, we tend to focus on, hey, what's the creative, cool way to build this new model, which is great, but that's on an old data set that's been around for a long time, and somebody else in a different lab got it into a format we could train it with. In the real world, it's incredibly difficult to get data from all these different sources actionable in a moment that you can actually train the models. And so I think like data engineering itself is really underappreciated, would be the first thing when it comes to commercial jobs outside of academia. And then I also think focusing on the use case and figuring out what models and things are relevant for that. And so in like a university environment with a PhD or something, maybe do get a little creative with the modeling approach. Once you have that use case, look at what people have used. Oh, there's some cool other technique maybe that we can use in that regard. And happy to talk to you about it as well. I'm an adjunct now at the biomedical engineering department.
Can I answer that too?
Cool.
So I have a master's degree in architecture and computer-aided design from the U. I think the thing that I learned the most from that, actually never went into architecture, I went into computers, was around problem solving. And I think that's probably the most critical skill that you can develop. It's not, do I know Python? Do I need to know a programming language, right? It's really around, do I know how to approach a problem, analyze it, determine what's the best steps to solve it, and come up with a solution, right? That's where you'll be very valuable to an employer. if you know how to problem solve rather than just knowing the latest technology or the latest architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. Do stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
just get your hands dirty, do stuff, and then when you interview with us for a job, we say, "What have you done?" And you say, "Man, these are the 10 things I tried, and they all failed." And we said, "That's amazing."
So I would follow that up with a sort of much more prosaic thing. I have no idea what the world's going to look like in 5 or 10 years, right? But what you need is networking and job hunting skills. And so have to know how to interview, and you need to find out for yourself like what you're interested in, and then have a goal of like, I want to do this, and then people can help you get to there. But if it's just more general, I want to be an AI, it's just like, it's hard to wrap the head around that. The other thing is that there are mentors out there who sort of help with the process of this. And I find that for a lot of, especially, all students, going from undergraduate, graduate, and beyond, that you don't have to think very hard about a job in a way, because yes, you applied, you got into graduate school, but there's an endless supply of universities for graduate talent. But once you graduate, it's kind of a little different. And there are organizations that have a 2-3 month program that says this is how you go out and find a job. Maybe people would find that useful.
Are there some other questions? Yep. Oh, cool. Yeah, we're going to give that one to Josh. That's what he lives day in, day out.
Yeah, welcome to my world. So I think it depends on what the AI technology is doing, right? And so for the ambient, and we actually launched an ambient company that's doing great, so that's wonderful. And it required more than just LLMs in order to make it scalable. That's another use case that I don't think is ever going to scale with just LLMs well. So for the ambient, we've had ambient solutions in our departments, and I still work clinically. I work a shift tomorrow back in San Jose. And we've had them forever. They were called Dragon, right? And they're voice recognition, and there's errors in there, and who owns those errors? I do. And before that, I had transcription, because I'm old, and I would talk into the telephone, and then at some point the chart would appear, and of course I read I signed it, right? And who owned those errors? I did. So I actually don't think that has fundamentally changed for the ambient solutions, because that is not a patient-facing solution, that is a physician-facing solution that helps me generate content that I then put into the chart. And so I own that like I do everything else. When it starts becoming AI, and we have, one of the things that we did was a early sepsis tool, right? Which is, we don't actually want something that tells me that someone is septic, which is a really bad infection, right? Because, well, if I need a pop-up to tell me the patient in front of me is kind of dying, then all hope is gone, right? It doesn't need a pop-up anymore. So instead, what we did is we partnered with someone and created, and it's an ML model that predicts someone who has no signs of sepsis in front of me when they arrive at the hospital, but those are the people that are going to become septic within 72 hours, and then they decline and die. And so that's one that we created, so it fits that use case. But for that, as a clinician, if you want me to rely on your decision support, you better carry the coffin with me, right? So that means you need to have FDA clearance. That means I need to be able to rely on it just like I rely on a CT scanner or the lab work. And so then the liability falls with the company and with FDA. And so I think it depends on the use case. Is it something for me to help me just generate content, in which case I'm responsible for my content, or is it something where I'm making a decision around a patient's life and well-being?
We're done in a couple minutes, right? Or is that it?
Yeah, let me,
Okay.
I've got a question for you.
Sure, yeah.
As you look ahead at AI, we've talked a little bit, Ray talks about how he uses algorithms in a genomic application, and Steve's talked about how they're using it for Seq Labs. How do you view it in medical devices? How will AI come into the medical device world and be effective there? What is your perspective of how that might happen? And then you have 5 minutes.
Oh, we have 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think these devices are producing mountains of data, way more data than we can possibly use. And so my company, at least, is built around making sense of that data and synthesizing it and making it actionable, and so kind of triaging use of it. And so it's been like a major barrier for use of devices, because right now we have all these smartwatches, we have all sorts that are collecting data in terms of the, but there's way too much of it. And so I think AI essentially can extract signal from that and provide information to providers and various people that they can make choices.
Yeah, I would add that I think there's a lot of places AI can be used in the manufacturing process and supply chain and the efficiencies of the manufacturing of medical devices. Certainly there's a lot of other areas, but I'm really focused a lot more on kind of back office operational efficiencies. How can I improve my operations of the company, as well as the manufacturability and the manufacturing of a medical device? I think AI can play a significant role there.
Yeah, I agree with the data. I think the other part and the back office operations is like, we're going gang, that's a great area. The other thing that I think is a really big one that I think has been so far fairly underappreciated is, has anyone ever tried to program an IV infusion pump? Right? Like, I've been far more educated, and you could argue that it was wasted dollars and time, but I could not program an IV infusion pump if my life depended on it, or yours for that matter. If there wasn't a nurse there to do it, we're done. And yet, I can now like ask Perplexity or ChatGPT in a natural language something, and it gives me a natural language response. And so I think just like I still remember the days of MS-DOS, and that's how you interacted with the computer, and then all of a sudden there was a graphic user interface, and it really unlocked a lot of not only what could a computer do, but who could do that with the computer, because it was such a nicer interface. I think a really underappreciated aspect of LLMs is how they can transform devices that are otherwise require a lot of training and are incredibly hard to use to make them really easy to use. And so I actually think the next explosion of what does AI do for transforming things is it's going to make devices more capable because it increases their scope, and a large reason why it's going to increase their scope is because it makes it so that everyone can do it.
Well, those are great answers. For me, the antidote that I have is for, say, an EKG and heart rhythms, and there can be wearables, and there's algorithms that can very sensitively detect those patterns, and there could be early warning of heart problems that nobody ever knew that they existed, and they could save patients' lives. So I'm very optimistic that it's going to be a transformative technology.
And maybe I'll try to squeeze in one last question, because this is something I've spent a lot of time on, and I think you as well, Josh, probably everyone here, what is it not useful for? Because it's pretty easy for me to say, oh, this is going to be great, I can apply these models, and then especially in medicine, realize, you know what, really, they just need to change their workflow in a certain way, or you need these people to talk to each other, and any cool model I build is not going to fix the situation. So what's an example of something you've encountered where it's like, this is not, yeah, it's never going to solve this, we need other solutions?
Well, I remember the early days of AI, where they would use it for identifying out of 1 million pictures, a picture of a cat, right? Yeah. That was always been the use case for AI. And I think it's been way overused, and I think it's not a place where you want to go.
Josh?
Yes, most of the problems that people come to me and ask me to fix with technology, especially in a corporate environment, are generally problems of culture or leadership. and I haven't seen a technology that fixes those besides culture and leadership.
So again, from a more prosaic viewpoint, for some of these large language models, if you can ask the right question, you might get a really good answer back. But how do you ask the right question? That's not so easy. And the other thing is that it might tell you very specific answers to very concrete questions, but if your question's a little more vague, like, how do I solve this problem? I don't know how it's going to help you say, this is how I solve this problem, because that's an approach issue. It's not a, what's the temperature in Bangladesh today, or something like that question.
Well, thank you. I think that's time, right? All right. Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody.